get that in this conversation, but hopefully this will continue beyond. And as Paul mentioned, we will be hosting a part 2 to this conversation that is more action oriented, and we invite you to use what you learned today and come join us again in September. And last, but certainly not least, I have the pleasure of, introducing our moderator for today, Swati Masser. And so she facilitates diversity and inclusion work at Mercy Corps. And having had the pleasure to chat with her a little bit, I kind of learned about why she's interested in the work that she does. And at Mercy Corps, she's most driven and finds the most pleasure in helping communities speak for themselves and help them find solutions that are appropriate for their situation and their context. And I was curious to know why she does this and what motivated her. And I learned that it kind of goes back a few years to rural India, and her grandfather, who created a model that I believe is still in practice today, that centered women, put them at the forefront and center of the conversation of family planning decisions. And I believe what struck her the most about that was that he didn't need the assistance of a Western doctor to come tell him how to best serve his community. And I think it's in that spirit that she continues to do her work at Mercy Corps. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Swati.
Thank you so much, Chizi, for that very kind introduction. And it's really wonderful to be here today with all of you, and just want to emphasize that we all are really appreciative of this learning journey that we're going to take with everyone here today. And so I just would like to take a minute to just introduce our panelists quickly and then give them the floor. So today we're really happy to have with us Adria Armbrister, who's the CEO and Principal Consultant of Nsoku Consultores. We have Itzbeth Menjivar, the founder of Bridge People LLC. We have Christopher Richardson, who's the General Counsel and COO of BGV Solutions LLC. And finally, we have Jelena Hasbrook, who's a communications consultant, and I must say a really dedicated ally in this work. And we're really proud to have all of you here and your perspectives represented. So I just wanted to start by actually handing it over to our panelists and asking each to share a little bit about their personal why. So I just want to ask all of you to reflect on what led you to this work around racial inequity, international development, and what guides you when this work gets tough, because we know it gets tough. So maybe, Adria, if you could kick us off.
Hi, good morning, afternoon to all of you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. You know, I think my why is really based on my life experiences. I like that introduction that Chizi did of you, Swati, because I think that being from an immigrant family really sets you up to look at the world in a different way. And so I feel, since high school, I really wanted to be in international development. I had a nickname that was based after the Secretary General at that time, which I won't tell you because then you'll know how old I am. And I think the race, ethnicity, and equity part came more into my work when I decided that I wanted to focus on global health. And again, personal experience there for me was really central in my deciding not to go into epidemiology, but rather into looking at health disparities, which was what it was called at that time. What keeps me going? I think now what keeps me going is thinking about whether or not I feel healthy in the situations in which I work. And if I don't, understanding that that means that what I'm doing for others is also, or could also have, not healthy outcomes there. And so, you know, because that's my goal, because I'm looking, you know, to have an impact, as we all do when we work in development, I am kind of kept going by trying to find situations and trying to grow in terms of my health within my work, and understanding that that radiates out to the communities that I serve.
I love that, Adria. I think that's such an important reminder for all of us to really center this and ground this work in how we bring ourselves to it. Thank you very much for that share. Beth, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Swati. And thank you, Sid, for this incredible honor of getting to share with this amazing audience. I'm just really very happy to be here today. My personal why, I think it's really, it surrounds around my own sort of personal battle against poverty since I was a child, like battling first my own poverty and that of my families through like education and, you know, being an immigrant and everything that our family had to endure to basically, you know, get to this country, get an education and all of that. I came into the international development work through that poverty reduction lens, wanting to make a difference in the places similar to where I come from, and to create opportunities for people that look and sound like me. Like understanding that just having had access to education provided such a huge area of privilege for me, and just noticing that in many of the environments where I worked, where I was the only one. And especially as I got more senior in my career, there were less and less people that looked like me. And I didn't have the racial analysis at the time to understand that this was a direct result of systemic exclusion. And in many ways, I bought the lies that there was something special about me, and that's why I happened to be the only one. And, you know, that's sort of like doing my internal work and realizing that I was basically, you know, part of a system that is intentionally excluding certain people for, you know, reasons around race, gender, economic status, etc. And what keeps me going, I say two things. I would say, first of all, just the fact that I feel that I am standing on the shoulder of giants, that there's many people who made very great sacrifices to open up doors for me. And I find a responsibility when I think about what legacy I want to leave behind of opening doors for others. And also just a really deep sense of our shared humanity. And, you know, I am sustained by my spiritual life, which really informs me to the value, the precious value and sacredness of human life, and that there is no such thing as a hierarchy of people. So that's my why.
That's so beautiful. It's Beth, and I think even in this work, we're constantly reminded of our own humanity as individuals and collectively. Yeah, I think that could probably resonate for many of us, and really appreciate that reminder. Christopher, would you like to share next?
Sure, and thank you all so much for inviting me. This is a real honor, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina. I grew up with pretty working class, well, by US standards, poor background. And I remember as a kid really dreaming and reading these encyclopedias and books about these other countries in the world, and really just being excited by that and really attracted to this idea that, you know, America's place in the world and my place in America could make a difference, I guess, as a kid, in that naive kid kind of way. I went on to college and then law school. I practiced law for 3 or 4 years, and then decided that I was going to be a US diplomat. And so I joined the State Department. I worked as a diplomat for 7 or 8 years. And what I found was that in the work of diplomacy and in working for our government, that a lot of notions and things that we think of and we tell ourselves about America, the story of America, it simply wasn't true. Not only was it not true, but that we as a country really focus not necessarily always on this democracy, diplomacy, development, but there's an other side to our country that we don't talk about. And for me, that became very clear when when Donald Trump was elected, and we had the travel ban. And as a State Department official, I was asked to enforce the travel ban. And what I found was that it was amazing how fast people in government decided to live with this, decided to live with injustice, decided to live with enforcing this travel ban, saying that, you know, and letting this president say the things that he said and do the things that he wanted to do without much challenge or opposition. And so I quit the State Department to focus on helping immigrants, to use my legal background to help immigrants. And what motivates me and keeps me going is anger. Anger at the way this country is working, anger at the way this world is working, anger at how historical context is ignored to grease the pockets of wealthy individuals all across the globe. Angry at the fact that we spend so much money on militarization without knowledge of why we're spending that money on militarization. And so what keeps me going is hope for the future, but also very much anger at what is going on in today's world.
Yeah, Chris, we really look forward to hearing more of your insights on that, because I think that what you're touching upon is really at the heart of the work that we're going to get at today, in terms of how do we dismantle these structures. And also, as a really nice segue to our last panelist, Jelena, I think there's a lot that you were saying about narratives that's super important for us to think about as we dismantle, decolonize aid and development. So thank you very much for those reflections. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jelena to share with us a little bit about her why.
Thanks, Swati. Yeah, you know, for me as a white woman, I grew up in California in the US and was really fortunate to have a family, in particular a mother and a grandmother who came from a history of labor organizing. And so I grew up kind of being taught that the world is not as shiny and perfect as it likes to portray itself in the US in terms of our history, and kind of like Chris said with how we think of the US and how we're raised to think about it. So I was fortunate enough to be having conversations, even from being a young child, about white privilege and what that meant. And then as I grew up, I really started, you know, learning more and more about the history of colonialism in the US and around the world, what that meant, white supremacy, how we started our country, and I would say it was also an unlearning of all the myths that I'd been taught about the US and about, you know, the myth of meritocracy and individualism. And so kind of those things together, as I went through the world, really gave me a feeling of responsibility as a white person to contribute to that dismantling. I, you know, connected to what guides me. There's a lot of speakers and quotes that I kind of draw upon, and two that come to mind as I think about this is there's a quote from a TV show where an indigenous activist says to, or a white woman asks an indigenous activist, how do you keep fighting all these injustices when they're from the mother of injustice? You know, how do you keep going? And her response is, what's the alternative? And to me, that really kind of gets at that for me as a white woman, I can't just continue going about in this world as if racism, white supremacy, and these things don't exist, because I'm contributing to it. And the other quote I think about is James Baldwin is one of my heroes, and talks in one of his speeches, I believe it was in the early 70s, about the period of time before the rebellions of enslaved folks in the US. And he talks about that time as non-cooperation. And while he's talking about that in terms of the enslaved folks not cooperating with the system, I think about that as my responsibility. How am I either cooperating or not cooperating with these kind of white supremacist systems and reinforcing that? So that's my way. The other thing that kind of sustains me, I'll be honest, is humor. If I was one of those people who was taught to, you know, laugh or cry and feel your emotions, and I have the privilege to be able to do that in a way, and so humor also kind of sustains me through this work. And the last thing I'll just say is I think that led me to a lot of this communications work, where you know, there's so much we can do in language that reinforces racism and white supremacy and these dominant paradigms, and so how I try to work on how we can dismantle through communications.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jelena. Sounds like this has been in your blood and in your lineage for a long time, and it's really great to see that. And I think you set us up really nicely to kick off our discussion today, to talk a little bit about the historical context when we think about rewriting narratives, or talking about the truth that many of us have not been born or raised with. A question to specifically Itzbeth, Adrian, Christopher, from what you were sharing. We know that racial injustice and inequities have been, with us for centuries, predating America's birth, well predating America's birth, in the form of colonialism. And how have these practices, these historical precedences, how have they led to the disenfranchisement of people of color, the structural inequities that we see today that show up in the field of international aid and development?
Great, thanks, Swati. Thank you for starting with that easy question. And I'm being a little facetious, sorry. I think that it's important to, first of all, understand the issue of systemic racism at all of the different levels at which it manifests itself, from the individual to the systemic, right? And how they all feed one another, and how it's important to address them all. But that really, when we are talking about systemic racism, I really believe that the focus needs to be on structures, right? Like that this is not only about individuals with problematic views, this is about how it's baked into our systems, our policies, just, the way that structures are just arranged across our government and have been for generations. And I would even go further back than even from before the inception of the United States, but really kind of around the times of colonization and the greater global order. And it makes me think of like a place like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I spent quite a bit of time working over a number of years, and understanding that as an international development professional, when we were looking at root causes of poverty, we never talked about colonialism. We never talked about the incredible oppression and torture and just very brutal systems in a place like the Congo. We never talked about the engagement of corporations, and particularly the tech industry, in the extraction of minerals in the Congo, and how it's basically benefiting corporations for the Congo to be a failed state, essentially, that it's really sort of against the US and the corporate interest that it represents abroad to like help the Congo get itself sorted out, because then we can provide cheap minerals for the technology industry in this country and around the world. So I think that we have been avoiding conversations about race for way too long. And where they originated, when race was invented as a tool to expand colonial power and wealth and access and privilege for white people and European descendants at the expense of everyone else, and how even things like the borders of some of these countries where we work are artificial impositions from Western rich countries on countries like the DRC and other countries in Africa and across the world that now have to live with those decisions made by external folks. And another, just a last example, is the fact that the CFA franc, the currency of a lot of Western and Central Africa, it's like still basically controlled by the French, and where countries don't have sort of autonomy over their monetary policy, and how that drives additional poverty in their countries, and how so many of the resources have to sit in a French bank, right? So this is way beyond the United States. It's really a global issue, and I think that race and how I think particularly descendants of like people who were enslaved from African countries in particular have fueled the development of so much of the West at the expense of those countries, and how they continue to be marginalized and basically kept in poverty for the benefit of those of like the neo-colonialists that want to control the extraction of resources. So I'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah.
I
Go
just
ahead,
want to
Adria.
add very quickly, because I know that Chris is going to do a much deeper dive, that talking about the Americas, which is where I work, I think that the 1619 project by the New York Times did a great job at detailing how much of our labor structure in terms of how we're paid, you know, our shift work, and all of that came out of the system of enslavement of Africans, and how that system was responsible basically for organizing our economic system that is currently in use. I think if we talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, in addition to those things, you know, there's a hierarchy that was established during colonialism that was very complex, but pretty easy to understand, and it was based on skin color. And that hierarchy continues to function to this day, so that, you know, those who are white, if you look at the leaders of countries in Latin America, they're mainly white, they're not even mestizos. And as you kind of move down the hierarchy, you know, at the bottom are Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples. And so when we look at international organizations, it's the same look is happening, right? The idea is that those who are supposed to be leading, who are white, and sometimes mestizos, or white mestizos, should be the ones who are at these organizations, and that's who's there. And those who are excluded are the ones at the bottom, and that's us. So I wanted to also kind of make that direct parallel between the past and today.
Yeah, that's so important, Adria. And before I kind of jump in, I wanted to give Christopher an opportunity to weigh in with your experience as well.
Oh yeah, and please stop me if I go over. So I wrote an article, an op-ed to the New York Times recently about the State Department and its history with racism and discrimination. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do is really study these organizations that we work for, not just the historical nature of them, not just the foreign policy, but look at the specific organization that you work for and what role they specifically play in racism or in sexism. So the State Department, for example, is a professional organization. They have a professional exam that was supposed to make things professional. When an African American in 1924 passed the exam, the State Department's reaction wasn't, oh, this is so great, we have an African American. The State Department's reaction was horror. They had a meeting where they sat down and said, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? How can we make sure that no other Black person passes this exam? And so they kept Black African Americans out of the State Department for 20 to 30 years by using the exam process to keep Black people out. And then by the 1950s, when they could no longer do that, they decided to use the security clearance process to keep Black people out. And then by the 60s and 70s, when they can no longer do that, they used other mechanisms to keep African Americans out. This stuff wasn't secret. It wasn't subtle. They literally had a meeting and said, how can we keep Black people out? And so if those are the type of people that are leading your diplomatic efforts, if those are the type of people that are writing those policies about their fellow citizens, imagine what they're doing with the rest of the world. And so when you think about US diplomacy or US aid, and think about what our role is, you really have to dig deeply into what is that historical context. And so, for example, China is a great example where, as Americans, we tell ourselves, we don't know why China might hate us. You know, it might be something with the communism, it might be the competition, but no one mentions that, you know, at the turn of the century, between 1898 and 1900, there was something called the Boxer Rebellion, where 8 Western countries invaded China because they didn't want Christian missionaries there in China, and they didn't want financial backing in the US and all these other countries to do that. People ask, well, why does Russia hate us? But no one talks about in 1919, we and again 7 or 8 other Western powers invaded Russia to try to install our own powers in it. In Mexico, there were multiple revolutions where the United States had a role and played this role in trying to enforce the rights of businesses and businessmen in the economics of it. We have to understand that, you know, as Americans, we like to tell ourselves this story about how, you know, what we're doing is for freedom and justice and the American way. And that stuff's all good, but always look under the hood, because there's always another story to all the stories about that we tell ourselves as a country. It's really fascinating that a lot of Americans have just learned about Tulsa. And they're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that this Tulsa thing happened in America. Can you believe that? And I tell people, Tulsa is everywhere. Every city in America had a moment where Black businesses were burned. DC had multiple revolutions or multiple instances where white people burned the Black part of town. And that's been the story of America, where every country you point to, there's an American business involved or American businessman that has to be protected or has to be helped and aided. And so I think that when we look at development and aid and the State Department, we really have to have a dig deeply into these things. And so Haiti and the Dominican Republic are perfect examples, where for basically 40 or 50 years, if not more than that, the United States basically controlled the financial structure of those two countries. I can name you dozens of countries, almost every country in the world that isn't a Western country, where the United States had a hand and a role. Mexico is a perfect example, where before 1910, the US controlled 40 to 50% of all the property and economic interests in Mexico. There's so many examples that we can point to in the world. And so I think that when we look at this history of colonialism and we look at the problems that go on today, we can't just say, oh, these things just came yesterday. You know, I think a lot of people I talk to at the State Department, they go to a country and they pretend that America has never had a role in this country, in the development of this country, for good or ill. And I think that before we go into these countries and before we talk about these other countries, you really have to understand, what is it that America did for you and what is it that America did to you?
Yeah. Christopher, I think that's so important. And one of the things that I feel that you're highlighting in what you're saying is, as we enter into these conversations, there's a tremendous amount of self-awareness that we need to have in these conversations. Self-awareness as country, as organizations, as communities, as individuals. And we need to be able to look at that with in a truthful way, and in a way that's not just perpetuating harmful narratives that we've perpetuated for centuries. So really appreciate that, and we'll actually put a pin in that and come back to it in a minute. And kind of to Christopher's point, I wanted to ask you, it's best to maybe talk to us a little bit about when we think about decolonizing aid. You know, what does this mean for all of us as individuals? One of the things I really love from Professor Kendi is this tension that we are all steeped in racist systems, and as individuals, there's this tension that we have to hold that on one hand, we can be perpetrators of these systems, no matter who we are. And on the other hand, we can be victims of these systems, no matter who we are. So I just wanted to ask you to kick us off in this part of the discussion. What is this, when we think about, you know, decolonizing aid and development, what does this mean for us as individuals?
Thanks, Swati. And I just want to say, Chris, thank you for that amazing summary, which I just want to add to it, is that all of this sort of like colonial and imperialistic expansion of the US wasn't really for the American people. It's really for like few corporations who are benefiting from this, right? Like it's really about enriching a certain elite, and particularly arms, you know, a lot of weapons and militaristic, that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to add that, like, if it had been for the people and had they been investing in people, well, maybe, you know, but not even that, right? So it doesn't really benefit the American people. In terms of decolonizing aid, I believe, you know, similar to, I think we agree as racial equity practitioners that every journey begins with a deep look inside. It really begins with a willingness for leaders to take the first step of looking in the mirror instead of looking out the window. And what I mean by that is that self-reflection. How am I benefiting from systems of oppression? How am I complicit in them? Who in my life am I oppressing? And it's something as simple as, like, for me, I realized one day, like, I have a lady who comes to clean my house every 2 weeks, and I had never invited her to my Christmas party. And she's Latina like I am, and like she would enjoy my kind of parties. How come I had never invited her? Like, you know, so like that to me felt like oppression. That to me felt like I'm not viewing her as equal because she comes to clean my house, right? And then in addition to doing that internal work, it's important for leaders to be setting the ground for creating shared language, really to give people a foundation for having dialogue. Shared language is the foundation for productive dialogue. And it's just critical that we be, you know, entering into dialogue with a common understanding of what we're talking about, right? Then, you know, once we have that shared language, I think that having the historic context is important so that people understand. I think that opens the floodgates of compassion for people when people feel like, why doesn't this community just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, when they understand that, like, our own government has been, you know, basically keeping the proverbial knee on their neck for generations. Of course, you're gonna experience poverty, crime, violence, those, and internalized trauma, right? And then we have to get trained on new behaviors. How do we rehumanize ourselves and others that we're working with to create the kind of environments that foster a sense of belonging for all staff? Because as long as we continue to just deal in assumptions and not dialogue and silence people, then we don't, you know, deal with it. So we need to train people on just new forms of communicating with one another and really honoring the sacred nature of humanity, and that we all have something to bring to the table, not just people with like a certain type of resume, right? So that's what I would say it takes.
That's beautiful. And I think also I really appreciate this notion of compassion and bringing compassion and nuance to these conversations, which we'll also come back to in a little bit. But I wanted to turn it over to Jelena. Jelena, as someone who identifies as white, what does this individual work look like for you and others who are white allies?
Thanks, Swati. Yeah, you know, it's interesting as I think about language and this word ally is actually not a word that I use to describe myself, and I'll tell you why. What I use and aspire and work towards being is a co-conspirator, and that term is something that I've heard from a variety of people, but I want to shout out Dr. Bettina Love for teaching it to me. And one of the stories that she often uses when she shares this term co-conspirator is that of Bree Newsome and James Tyson. So Bree Newsome is a black woman who a few years ago climbed the flagpole at the State House in South Carolina to remove the Confederate flag. The attention was on her. She was the one climbing. James Tyson was a white ally or co-conspirator, right? And why we think of him as a co-conspirator is that his role was to guard the pole. He guarded the pole that she climbed on. And at one point, the police were threatening to electrocute the pole that would have electrocuted her up on the pole. So he touched the pole. And because he knew, right, that they would not electrocute a white man. And I think about that in terms of co-conspirator versus ally, because to me, and I get, you know, really nerdy with words because I'm a comms person, an ally is to say, I see your fight and I'm going to come help you with your fight. This is not racism and white supremacy is not a fight just for Black, brown, indigenous people of color. this is a fight for white people to be in. We created the problem. We need to be a big part of, you know, dismantling the problem. So I use that a lot to think about also what my actions are, because I feel like thinking of myself as a co-conspirator also puts me more into a position of both action and also a position of figuring out where it makes sense for me to take action, and also where it makes sense for me to follow the lead of people of color in this work. And so I think that, you know, how I operationalize that, it is a lot of self-reflection. I think that especially in the past couple months, one of the things we've seen with some awakening happening in the part of the US with white Americans is there was this real jump and urge to read a bunch of books and to learn about all this. And, you know, I've seen so many things about what book should I read, and the books are sold out and all this. And I think that to me mirrors what a lot of times white people do when we try to wrestle with racism. And that is to say, there's got to be a really easy way to figure out how to be the good white person. And once you read enough books, I don't know if it's 3 or 5, you get to this position where you're, okay, good, I got it now. And I think what we have to remember, and one of the things I do and the people I work with talk a lot about, is that it's a constant process. There is no question in my mind, as much as I really try to work on racial equity, that I screw up all the time. I'm gonna screw up. I was indoctrinated in a country in which my skin color is so attached and interwoven with what everyone's been talking about in terms of the myth of America. And so I think for white Americans, it's that interlacing of seeing America as a place of freedom and the best country in the world and all of that is so linked to their identity as a white American. And so to recognize that is to have to admit that it's going to take a lot of unraveling and a lot of self-reflection. In tangible ways, I can tell you that there's a couple of things I do. There, you know, we talked about kind of this holding both truths, and that's something that I do. I am somebody who, you know, in my ancestors, I have ancestors who enslaved other human beings. I will always have to hold that. That will always be true for me. I also have John Brown as an ancestor. And so to me, holding both those truths help me see how, just like America, it's messy and you've got to unpack that. And then with that, there's 2 truths I also try to hold when I do this work and kind of just on a day-to-day basis. One of those is, how can I use my privilege to push on things where other people cannot? And so, for example, I've worked in spaces where, one example I often give is where I'll be the hiring manager for a role, and I will be told by, you know, the HR team, oh, we've got the pool of people for you. Here's your pool of people. And it's a primarily white pool of people. And where I will say, this isn't a diverse enough pool. We didn't do a good job recruiting folks of color for this role. And they will say to me, well, this is who we got. And I will say no. And I have put my foot down, lengthened timelines, pissed off executive directors to be able to say, no, this isn't going to happen. But I also know that I have the clout and the privilege to do that, right? On the flip side of that, the other thing I try to make sure I'm doing is also not harming folks of color. There's a way that if I use my privilege, because I have the clout and I will be respected for that, great, but it can harm other people. And so, for instance, there's playing out right now an example of this in one of the communities I follow on Twitter in the research world in academia, where a white professor told his Black grad students to fabricate results for a research proposal and said, oh, no, don't worry about it. I do it all the time. But what we know, right, is that white professor, if they were caught in fabricating results, they would have all this privilege to back up and defend, and he's not going to get fired for that. But he wasn't seeing that asking his Black grad students to do that threatens them in a way it does not threaten him because of privilege. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the things that I just try to do. And I think the last thing I'll just say is, it's really for me about speaking up and interrupting. It's about, you know, again, these wheels are turning. It is a machine all the time. So how do we stop that? How do we not cooperate? How do we just say, nope, this isn't okay? But be real thoughtful about that as a white person so that you're not doing it in a way that endangers folks of color.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. And I think what you really highlight is this is a journey and you have to interrupt the system. You have to constantly disrupt the system, whether that system is working inside of you or working externally within the organizations that we all operate in. And I wanted to just, in that spirit of delving into complexities, turn it over to you, Adria, because, you know, one of the aspects of white supremacy culture is, you know, to distill and oversimplify and turn things into binary conversations. And I wanted to take a moment to have you share your reflections with us on how do we acknowledge those complexities, those deep complexities that are inherent in all of this work, in dismantling centuries of racial injustice, racial inequity. How do we begin exploring those multitudes of complexities and intersectionalities that we all experience?
I couldn't unmute. This is a rough question as well. I think that I represent more international organizations. I've never worked for US government. And I think within that sphere of international financial institutions, the UN, there has been some move, some push to eliminate silos, right? I think part of this idea of, you know, everything is linear and everything fits easily into a certain lane was reflected in the structure of organizations as well. And I think that the move to even just create a matrix, which is still a straight line, right? But the move to even create matrices is an opportunity and has been used as an opportunity to begin to create transversal, cross-cutting attention to specific issues. For example, you know, in WHO, there are some issues around gender, race and ethnicity, disability, human rights, and health equity that are considered to be cross-cutting, so that everyone should be working on those. Supposedly, those areas should not only be within programming, but also within human resources, right? So you're looking to reflect the cross-cutting issues within your organization as well as without. How well that's working is another conversation. But I think that even taking advantage of that move, which is in response to countries, right? So member states are requiring that these organizations be less siloed and less hierarchical because they have to address problems in an intersectional fashion. And so I would say, you know, simply that taking advantage of member states' understanding of intersectionality is really a way to begin looking at how we can look at the multiple dimensions and the complexity of these problems.
Yeah, thank you, Adria. I think even naming it and acknowledging that it exists is a huge part of the process to, you know, shifting from an oversimplified and siloed system to one that really acknowledges and can deal with complexities. I want to zoom out a bit before we turn to the Q&A portion of this conversation. And Chris, I want to ask you to share with us, as somebody who's kind of been in the kind of development or sort of aid, foreign assistance sector, and then someone who's seen other pieces of this sector outside of it and the forces that really shape it. Can you help us understand, you know, to Adria's point, I think one of the first steps we have to make in addressing and dismantling the systems that exist is to name them so that we can talk about them. And so, Chris, could you share with us, given your experience and the knowledge that you have, what are some of those critical drivers of systemic inequity that we see showing up within the aid and humanitarian sector that, you know, are in the oxygen that our sector breathes and lives in?
I think that people who work in diplomacy, humanitarian aid, have this idea that because they work in diplomacy or humanitarian aid, that they are somehow immune to being racist or sexist. I think that, one thing that I've always heard at state was that, well, I'm a Democrat, I voted for Obama, I would have voted for him, like all sorts of things, right? Where it's like, well, because I work in this field and I vote the right way, quote unquote, the right way, that I somehow am immune to this. And I think that you see this in almost every aspect of aid. And so, yeah, I think that we have to first name it. But second, we have to look around us at who's in the room when decisions are made, how we evaluate programs, who do we have when we're, designing programs around aid, who's helping design those programs around aid, who's helping design things. An example I always use is that, well, two examples. One is that I knew so many people at State Department and at USAID who could tell me the price of cocoa beans in the rural countryside, who could tell me the name of every opposition leader, who could wax poetically about every intricate part of the agricultural system of a country, but who could not name a single Black person who was shot unjustly in the United States, who could not talk to me about Sandra Bland, who could not talk to me about Michael Brown. And I think that if we are going to talk about, how do we be better stewards of aid, we should look at ourselves as a country and our role in our own country and know our own country too. I think that knowing your country is actually very beneficial before you can learn about other people's nations. Because then it doesn't come across as hypocritical when you're out there and telling Russia and China and all these other countries about their human rights abuses. You're completely oblivious to the human rights abuses in your own country. You're completely oblivious to the mechanisms that you use to measure what aid program is quote unquote working and what aid program is not working. And so, yeah, naming it is important. Knowing the historical context of that country is important, but knowing your own history as well, I think is critically important. But also knowing that, again, a lot of this aid, it's crazy that in the US, there was something called gunboat diplomacy, where if you didn't, as a country, pay the US back its debt, the United States would send a Navy to your port to make you pay. And that was actually a form of diplomacy for the United States. And looking back on that now, it's like, wow, that's really, really crazy. But that's very much a part of who we are as a country. I'm not saying that, it's like we were talking about earlier that, it's amazing that this is the country of Martin Luther King and this is the country of the civil rights movement, but it's also the country of Robert E. Lee and the country of Jefferson Davis. And so we have this duality as a country that very much is reflected in the State Department and in USAID. But yeah, I think that having people in the room who look like maybe the people that you're supposed to be helping is probably a third good step as well.
Yeah, that definitely speaks to my heart, Chris, certainly when I think about even my purpose in this work. And thank you. I think that that's a really important point. And I wanted to also ask our panelists to talk a little bit about, when we think about naming these systems, why is it particularly important for us to also not shy away from and pay attention to anti-Blackness as we're trying to dismantle these systems? So I just want to give space for our panelists to share some reflections on that.
I would say that one thing that I've observed just kind of in the past couple of years in sort of our drives towards diversity and inclusion is that some organizations have done a great job at bringing in a lot of women and bringing in non-Black people of color. And where are the Black people, right? Like I was working in, covering African countries for a very long time. And I was often in my organization, the only person of color and the only Black person or like African descendant. So I just think that it really requires, and I think this is where non-Black people of color have a real opportunity to step up in their co-conspirator roles and understanding that in many ways they're being used as a wedge in this binary of Black and white, which is obviously, it's all false, right? It's a social construct. But, there are some that are being used as like model minorities, quote unquote, to drive a further wedge and say, well, these people, look at, this is the kind of diversity we have. these people have done their work, and they, through their merits, they made it, and kind of making it seem like there's something inherently wrong with Black people. And it's just something I think that really requires awareness and a great degree of solidarity.
I think I've seen a bit more nuance in this question. And I think my experience actually starts in college, where there's a specific anti-Blackness that's reserved for people from the country or countries in which the organization is working. So if we're talking about the US, often African Americans are replaced with Caribbean Americans or with Africans from Africa to fill the quota of Black people. And that is exclusion, right? I shouldn't be able to count the number of African Americans in my Ivy League college class, and I can on one hand. The rest of us were Caribbean immigrants or Africans. And so I think that thinking about anti-Blackness is not only about being Black. There's a specific exclusion that's specific to the context. Within Latin America, I think there's also a similar thing that happens where Black Caribbean people are used to fill the Black quota, while Afro-Latinos are excluded from organizations. Beyond that, I think there's an even greater exclusion of Indigenous peoples in those organizations. I have heard people say that Indigenous peoples don't have education, they don't have regional experience, and that's what they need to work here. So even if you put a CV in front of their face that shows you, this person who has 3 master's degrees, they can't see it. I had one person who was completely disqualified. She had an Indigenous last name, she dressed like an Indigenous person, and they were not having it. And so I think that there's definitely anti-Blackness. That anti-Blackness is often very specific. And there's also anti-Indigenous peoples. And I think that we as Black people also have a role there of being co-conspirators, at least in this region, around that issue.
Can I add something real quick
Please.
about just real quick on anti-Blackness? I think that there's a sense that if I have Black people in the room, that makes the difference. And I think it does make a difference, but I think that as Black people, we also have to be careful because white supremacy has a way of being very insipid in who we are. An example I'll use is the country of Liberia. Now, I know most people don't know this, but in the 1820s and 1830s, 20 to 30,000 freed African Americans went to Liberia to start a country. And to basically, it was like a colonialization society that America had. So a bunch of old white Americans who were like, well, I don't know what to do with my slaves, sent them to Africa. And everyone thought, oh, if you send these Black people to Africa, everything's going to be okay. What these former slaves did was that they built plantations, they instituted slavery in Liberia, and controlled this country. And you would think that, well, these were former slaves. How could former slaves go to Africa, reinstitute slavery, build plantations, grow cotton, and basically do everything that they had escaped? And it's because that's the only thing that they knew. That's the thing that people have to understand, is that as Black people, all we know is white supremacy. Guess what we're going to do? We're going to be white supremacists. We're going to call ourselves white. Even as dark as I am, I'm going to call myself white, and I'm going to find the local Native people and do the things to them that were done to me. And so I think it's important that, having Black people in positions of power, that's important, that's critical. But I think that as Black folks, we then need to stop and take a step back and be like, well, hey, what is this coming from? Where is my place of power? Where's my place? Is my place in my discussion with you from a place of my oppressor? Or is it from a place where I'm trying to break free from my past and break free from this white supremacy that is very much steeped within all of us? If you are an American, you have that white supremacy in you. Whether you want to or not, you have it. And we all have to break it, even me as a Black person. And I saw this in every country I went to, where I'd be around other Black officers and we would judge these other people in these other countries the same way white folks were judging us back in the United States. And so Black oppressors Black people have to look at themselves and ask, well, am I being Black right now? or American right now? And if you are being an American right now, you need to ask yourself, well, where is that coming from? So I'm sorry, I had to go on that tangent.
No, I think that's so important. And I just major props to that point, because I think that in all of this work, it's decolonizing ourselves, right, first. And I think that there's so much to this about being counterculture in every single way, and really requires us to look at this from a complete paradigm shift to something that probably none of us have experienced, or probably, I mean, the more cynical side of me will ever experience, but hope to experience in some day. I think it's just really important, and I think a really important framing as we all continue in this journey and think through what do we need to do to operationalize and make that new paradigm a reality. So I know we want to save some time for questions and answers, so I'll turn it over to my colleague Jamila to share some questions that the team has collated together ahead of time. So Jamila, over to you.
Thank you everyone for this insight. This has been such a great discussion and something that we've been trying to bring to the forefront for several years now. So just so glad we were able to get this off. We asked folks to submit questions in advance because, as you can see, we have a packed house and it's a little bit hard to manage hundreds of questions. So we're going to start with some questions that were submitted in advance before we take some questions from the chat and then questions from those on the phone. So this first question is very long and packed, and I'm going to direct it at Chris. So it's, can international development successfully escape the racist and colonial past? Do we need to start over and throw this all out, or are there current reforms that can be done to save this current system? But when we think deeper about international development, we know it's a part of foreign assistance. And we know that international aid has been politicized and haven't been used to end poverty, but to continue to perpetuate control. What do we do?
Yeah, in my 3 minutes, let's see if I can resolve.
Wherever you leave off, I'm sure your other panelists can help you.
You know, and I wish I could say that I knew the answer, but I don't. This is something I've struggled with myself in terms of the State Department. Because very much the State Department and the modern State Department is built on white supremacy. Again, they had meetings, they sat around in meetings, said, how can we keep Black people out? And you can't build a system like that and maintain a system like that for 70, 80 years without that system being corrupt. Now, is it corrupt to its core? Do we need to throw the whole thing out? Maybe so. And it's something that I really don't have the answer to, but I do think that we need to continue talking about it. We need to continue thinking about, if we throw this system out, what does a more equitable system look like? And how do you ensure that in that new equitable system, you are meeting, I would say the issues of the past, because a lot of people are like, well, let's just throw it all out. But you could do that, but does that make up for all the stuff that the old bad system did? And also, how do you get buy-in from the people that benefited from that system? I know in the State Department, I talked to a lot of former Black diplomats who did really, really well in the State Department, and they'll tell you, oh, everything was great, everything was fine. I don't know what everyone was complaining about. And it's like, of course they don't know, because like they benefited from that system. Or even people who benefited from that system trying to then reform the system. Well, why would I trust you to reform the system when you're like the beneficiary and the cause of all of these problems? And so I think that we have to ask ourselves, not only should we throw it out, but who gets to do the throwing out, and who gets to make the new system? Do you have people who have no experience with the system? Or do you have people who have different experiences with the system? Or do you have people who benefited from the system then trying to rewrite the system because they know all the tricks of the trade? And so, yeah, I know that's not like a really like hopeful answer, but it's probably the only answer that I can genuinely give.
Yeah. Super fair, Chris. I think this is an existential question that probably every single one of us is grappling with. Beth, I want to turn it over to you to give your thoughts on that as well.
I think that was brilliant, everything that Chris said. And I would only add that I think it's really key, A, to be willing to imagine the world that we want to live in. And as we're visioning and imagining for that potential future, as we hit those barriers and blockages that tell us like that isn't doable, like to really examine like why isn't it? Who made those rules? Is it time to throw it out the window? That kind of thing. And that particularly when we're talking about situations of aid, situations of charity, situations of helping people, they need to be included. Those who are most impacted by any decision that we made need to be at the center of the conversation, and their voices need to be seriously taken into account.
Yes, that is absolutely critical to any sort of equitable process. Yeah. Angelina, I wanted to offer you a moment to comment also, because I know so much of your work is dedicated to rewriting narratives and rewriting the way we think and talk about what we do. So just wanted to offer you a few minutes to share some reflections on that question.
Well, I think it really builds off both of what Chris and Isbeth just said. I mean, I think the United States of America is white supremacy on autopilot. It is, and that's what happens. And so as we communicate, like the standard traditional ways of doing things often are communicating white supremacy in just how we're describing things. And so often for me in my work, it's about trying to stop that in its tracks as much as possible and ask questions explicitly when we're looking at pieces of writing. Also visuals. I'm big on visuals for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that our brains take in and keep visuals in a really different and more memorable way than words. So because of that, I am an evangelist for being really intentional about your visuals. When in the work that I have done a lot with nonprofits and advocacy orgs, there's like a standard set of stock photos that everyone uses, and it's the same kind of stuff. And I came into a workplace working on educational justice and equity and saw the same photos being used, and it was always light-skinned Black folks with not natural hair. Like there was no variety. It was just colorism all over the place, and that was just normalized. And so part of the work, I think, is to stop that in its tracks and say, no, let's do something different. Let's, and often there's this response of it's going to take more time, or we can't do this. What are those roadblocks? And then I think it's really getting clear with, yes, all of this is baked in. It's been baked in for however many centuries and generations, but we baked it in. It wasn't aliens that came from another planet and dropped our society on us. We made it so we can unmake it. It's going to be hard. I don't have the answer either, but I think just keeping that as I've looked at things, and then getting really clear on not reinforcing the very things you're trying not to. I was working with a client recently that we were putting together a messaging guide, and they wanted to put something in there about basically don't reinforce stereotypes when you talk about Black and brown students. And what they did was wrote a paragraph that reinforced stereotypes to say, don't do this. And, there's a George Lakoff, a political professor who writes about language and politics, has a book, Don't Think of an Elephant. If you tell people not to think about something, they're going to think about it. So even in those ways, it's really stopping and reflecting and saying, what is this reinforcing or dismantling? What are the photos we're using? I'll give you an example of language. There's a way that, especially in nonprofits and advocacy worlds, we talk about things in America from a very individual standpoint. This myth of the individual, and that, it reinforces all of what we've been talking about. And so when you look at things like educational equity work, and people will say, students are struggling to achieve at a school. And it's really getting finite and line item that and say, no, flip that. Schools are struggling to serve students effectively. And it's just those little switches where you start to see, is the focus of what we're saying, is the focus about an individual, or is it really informed and understanding and explaining in some way how a system is playing a part there? So that's kind of what I would do. But I also think imagining what the world could be and really making sure we know that as hard as it is, it's, we can try to dismantle it as much as we can reinforce it.
Yeah, I think that that's really helpful to understand how the day-to-day actions, the words we use, the way we frame anything, frankly, can contribute or continue the harm. So yeah, I think that's a really, really great way, and lots of great reminders. And I hope in the next session and next conversation, we can seek to unpack more of the ideas that you just presented there, Jelena. And Andrea, I wanted to also give you the opportunity to share some of your reflections on this very thought-provoking question.
One thing I didn't mention when I talked about, how I got into this this field, this idea. I'm now an atheist, but at the time when I was younger, and I like that Jelena used the word evangelical. I was an evangelical. That's how I grew up in a church. It was very focused on missionary work. And that's also one of the things that got me to be an atheist. But I think that because I have that background, I see the very clear parallels between working in international development and missionaries, the work of missionaries. We call our trips missions. We call, some of the country offices are called missions. And I think about, what was the process for me in unreligionizing myself? And how can that also happen, in this very parallel process of, decolonizing development? And I think one of those is kind of what we're doing, right? Talking about what the inconsistencies and untruths are that we believed or believe with regarding to what we are doing. And I think the second is being very intentional. And I like how Jelena talked about, visuals and words, being intentional on changing even the use of this religious language within our work, because it very much relays the idea that we have the word, and then we're going to give the word to someone else, right? That's what a missionary does in order to save them. And so, how do we turn that back and, understand that it's the community that's going to save itself, right? I got some tools that I can provide to help with, with that if they want them. How do I change myself from being a missionary to being a servant, or I don't even say partner because it doesn't even work. So, I think it's a thought process for me. I will also say something a little controversial. And I think that one of maybe the only positive thing that I've seen out of the Trump administration is the current fight with the WHO. The threat of the US pulling out of the WHO within the organization has meant a deep rethinking of how that organization is working, how they're spending funds, who they're hiring, mainly because they feel like they won't have money from the US next year. But sometimes it's those types of explosions that make these organizations rethink their entire model. And so, yeah, sometimes you just have to, spook who sat by the door and blow it up or something.
And really look at those moments as opportunities for change. I think that's a really important piece of it.
Swati, if I can just add a quick thing that I think I meant to add and I forgot, it's just I think that in many ways what we're experiencing globally is a lack and a vacuum of leadership. We're really missing leaders that understand how to lead in equitable and inclusive ways. And I just want to invite everyone to step into a position of leadership. You don't need a leadership title to lead. And that's really what it's going to take, is just transformative leadership to get us to get different results and different outcomes.
Thank you, Itzbeth. I think that's really hopeful. And Jamila, I wanted to also give us time for maybe one more question.
Yes, so I think we'll take one more pre-submitted questions and maybe do one from the audience. We have about 15 minutes left. While we have been talking about terminology, that's great because that was a lot of the questions. One thing that has came through, I think is interesting, it says, lately my colleagues have been using the term decolonize without knowing what it means. How do we avoid the numbing trendiness of decolonize, Black Lives Matter, and other anti-racist movements so that it doesn't get lost, but we actually do the real work to change?
Jelena, would you like to take that one on first?
Oh yeah, that's an easy one. Curious to hear what other panelists think too. I think for me, I'm remembering years ago when I was an undergrad, and I remember at the time it was the thing to say was, I'm not racist, but, and that's what we used to then say the racist things. And I remember at the time I was doing a lot of reading of about white privilege, this is in the early 2000s, and I remember thinking at the time, privilege is going to become the next thing. I know I'm privileged, but, and now we see that. And I think these ways that the words get co-opted are really problematic. I don't have the answer per se. I think one thing I try to do with language is make sure, again, I think this was said earlier, that we have a shared definition. Like, what does that mean? If I was in a meeting and someone used decolonize, I would say, well, what do we mean by that, to really unpack that? And I also come from a world where the term equity is used all the time in everything, and no one has a shared definition of it. So I think for me, it gets back to this shared definition, because if you start to say, okay, well, what does that really mean? Then you're forced to link it to actual actions rather than using it as a buzzword.
Yeah, I think linking to action is clearly an important way to move forward.
Could I just,
you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just want to add that I think that we have to be careful with people using these words like Black Lives Matter, decolonization, as a mechanism of guarding themselves from doing any sort of change. And what you say, so Jamie Dion, the head of Chase Bank or whatever, wore like kente cloth and went down there and kneeled on Wall Street saying, oh, Black Lives Matter, but he's still evicting people from houses, So I think for me, like, I don't particularly care if you think Black Lives Matter or don't matter. I care about your actions. I care about what you're doing. I care about how you're doing it. So if someone says to me, Black Lives Matter, I don't really, you say a lot of things. I want to know how exactly it matters to you. And what are you going to do in your life today, tomorrow, and the next day to make sure that those Black lives matter? Because I think that what we're seeing is that there's a lot of focus on the symbols of progress and the symbols of oppression, and not the actual oppression and not the actual ability to make change in our country. And that change is hard and it's long, and it's not something that's going to be done just because you say you're going to do it. And so I think for me, if you say that word to me, I'm going to ask you as well, like, what does that mean to you? And how are you going to make sure that it happens, not just Tuesday, but Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday as well?
Yeah, I think authenticity, looking under the hood and looking beyond the narratives is really important.
Swathi, I know we were going to take one question from the chat. And so I've gone through, and I apologize that we won't have the chance to ask every question. But I did see one question that I'd like to pose to the panel, Chris, particularly, if that's okay. So Chris, a panelist or an attendee asked about, and I think it touches on your point about internalized oppression. Often in some of the countries organizations work in, clients or beneficiaries, partners, that's a lot of wording in here, have specific strict requirements about experience, or maybe they're used to the people who are coming to do the work being of a certain hue. And so as a person in the sector, how can I empower people of color while still getting my proposals passed through and meeting clients' requirements that may inadvertently or advertently disenfranchise people who look like them from being the ones to cooperate and work with them?
I think that we have to find a way, when you're looking at proposals and it's your job kind of to educate your client, to the extent that you can, on why their requirements might need to be changed or altered. And you have to have the courage to do that. And I use that word courage because it's really hard to tell clients, to tell the government, to tell people that what they're doing might not be in the best interest, and that the way that they're doing it might not be in the best interest. If you know that based on your own experiences, that that the requirements, the way they're written, are going to exclude people, and I mean, to me, I think that you have an ethical and moral obligation to yourself to tell them so, and to find ways to work around that. But I think that that's really hard, and that takes a lot of courage to force that on people. But yeah, I think that we have to find a way to be honest, be courageous, but to be persistent with both of those things, because that's the hard thing. The bureaucracy's goal is to wear you down. That is the job of the State Department, USAID, everybody. If you come in there and you're complaining, they expect you, they'll be so nice to you. They're gonna be, oh my gosh, you're so right. You're so true. I didn't think about this. But they expect you to go away after a week, just the same way America does with Black Lives Matter. And so you have to be like writing this thing down literally on a sheet of paper or on a sticky note or whatever, and be very intentional, but also be very persistent in highlighting what you think needs to change, but also how you're going to change it otherwise, and also reach that point that maybe you need to move on to do something else with your life if you feel like what is being presented to you isn't the best for you or the organization.
Yeah. Adria, I wanted to give you a minute to respond to that question too, so I imagine you have experience that you might want to share.
I can't remember the question. I liked Chris's answer, but I can't remember what the question was.
It was focused around the recipients of the aid or the funds themselves, maybe requiring a certain type of person with an experience or a certain look to do the work.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything additional to add. I think exactly what Chris said in terms of, having the courage to tell your client that, things have to be, or things can be changed and you can still get the same quality. I've heard people say, well, we don't want to reduce, we don't want to reduce the quality, or we don't want to reduce the expertise that we have here if we include people of color. So I agree with his response.
Great. It's Beth. Jelena, do you have other reflections to add before we head into kind of close? Okay, and I just wanted to ask our panelists to reflect upon two questions as we kind of close our discussion today, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, so thank you so much, and I hope everyone else has too. The two questions I want to ask all of you to reflect on as we move forward and prepare, especially this conversation, to move forward into thinking about how do we actually do this? How do we decolonize development and move away from kind of the jargon to really dig in and make change? What is either a reflection you would want to leave our participants gathered here today with to think about as we move forward, or a question that you think all of us should leave with and really grapple and think about? And then the second question is especially for our young professionals who are entering their careers in this space in international development, diplomacy. What is some advice that you have, particularly for people of color? So those two questions. Anyone want to start?
I think I'm going to be quick, so maybe I'll start. I think one takeaway. Someone asked the question in the chat earlier. Why do we have so many foreign aid workers anyway? And I think that's a good question. But at the same time, these organizations are going to exist. They've existed since the end of of World War II, and they're going to continue to exist. If I'm talking about international organizations, and for that reason, we need to be there, right? They have impact in the rest of the world, and we want to make sure that impact is just and equitable. I think that I was going to read an excerpt. I kind of use or look at my career as a reflection of this book, The Spook Who Sat by the Door by Sam Greenlee. And I have since college, and I encourage you to read that book. You don't have to do everything that happens in that book, but I think it's a good way to think about, you know, how you can be strategic in developing your career. And so the one advice, I guess, for people who are, you know, looking to the future of their careers is, you know, think about time. I think it's very telling that most of us on this call have our own consulting firms or our own businesses. And I heard a statistic somewhere that like 80% of people who are consultants have left, you know, their structured jobs because of issues of discrimination, whether that be just, you know, gender or for other reasons, race, etc. And so I think that if I were talking to myself in the past, I would definitely have made a timeline, right? How long do I need to be in XY organization, and what do I need to get out of this, right? So that if I need to be on my own later on, I can use that as leverage, or I can have a network available to myself. So I would just say plan and think about timing and how long you want to be in certain situations, and what is it that you need from each of your work situations. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Adria.
And I'll jump in and quickly just build off that. I think I agree with all of that, and would add that, you know, one of the things I've come to learn and wish I knew younger in my career was that your job is not your life. And I say this as somebody who is fully committed to doing justice-related work for my life, but still recognizing that in order to do that, I have to also work as much as possible to keep myself healthy and grounded. And so I think that especially, and I've worked for 2 decades in nonprofits.
Get in, I hope I didn't use like the only.
I've worked for 2 decades in nonprofits, and it is by the nature of that nonprofit industrial complex exploitative of people that work within it. And so I think just being aware of that and making sure that you're able to, as much as possible, protect yourself. I think the other takeaway for me is kind of building off what's been said. This is a huge undertaking, and it's a lot. And it's not just, we're going to have the one meeting. It's like Chris said, what are you doing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, every day? And part of that for me in thinking about language and all of that is introducing cognitive dissonance over and over again to continually, and sometimes that's as simple as asking the question, why? Why do we do this? You know, oh, this fellowship program is designed this way, and it's this and it's this. And being able to take the moment to just say, okay, well, why? Why did we make this decision? And be able to interrogate those things so we don't just run on autopilot as much as possible.
Thank you, Jelena. That was really well said. It's been.
Yeah, I would say 3 things, and they answer kind of both questions. The first one is that I really want to invite everyone to really consider embodied approaches. And by embodied, I mean we as human beings, we're mind, body, and spirit, you know, and emotions, or whatever you want to call it, kind of your spiritual life. And I think that systems of oppressions have made us dehumanize ourselves, like separate ourselves from our bodies, from what we're feeling, from, you know, because by numbing ourselves, then we can produce more, and it attaches our value to what we can produce. And we just got to be very clear that human life has value that could never be encapsulated by what somebody produces. So I just want to invite people to bring all of who they are, and to welcome, when in conversations about race, when people show up with emotions and anger and pain, be ready to receive it. Create space and grace for it, because there's a lot of trauma that people are sitting with in their bodies from living in a society that is constantly telling us that we're not enough. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is to really learn to recognize how systems of oppression show up in your everyday life, because they show up everywhere. A really great book that has made a great difference for me. It's called Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva, who provides indigenous wisdom you know, how to think about wealth. And he talks about systems of oppression always showing three characteristics: divide, control, and exploit. And whenever you can just feel it in your body, when you feel like, who am I trying to divide? Who am I trying to control? Who am I trying to exploit? That tells you of like how you can do something different. And that the antidote to that is connect, relate, and belong. That we're all seeking that belonging, that human connection of just not being afraid of just that, you know, recognizing the humanity in ourselves so that we can recognize it in others as well. And then the last one is really around that internal work that needs to happen. And I think a really great resource, if you just Google characteristics of white dominant culture, it gives you some really great ideas of how to, you know, how to contrast sort of like what we think is like, that's just how you do things. No. This is how we do things in white dominant culture. We have many other cultures in this great multicultural country of ours that can inform different ways of showing up in teams and how we treat people and what we value and that kind of thing. And I think it would be just a really great resource for everyone. And I'm just so thankful to be here today with this amazing panel who are really the la creme de la creme. I'm just really honored to be here with all of you today.
Thank you, it's Beth. And I imagine Jamila and Chizi can share the Temo Okun piece with others ahead of the next event. But Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be
Give
really
us
quick.
The last word.
I'll be really quick. I often quote Matthew 6:21, which is, you know, where your treasure is, your heart will also be, you know. And I think for America, and as Americans or people all over the world, where you put your money is kind of where your heart is as a nation. And so for us, there are more military grocers, people who work in our military groceries, than US diplomats. We have more people in the military band than we have US diplomats in this world. And I think that if you look at a country and we look at where we're going as a world, look at where we put our money, look at where we put our resources as a country, as a whole. And then you'll see what motivates us as a people. Now, don't look at these things and say, I'm just going to turn a blind eye to them because that hurts my aid and my ability to you know, be a good steward of donations. No, look at that as an honest and critical part of our structure, and look at ways and think about, okay, so if I'm in Niger and we have 1,000 troops in Niger, why are they there? What are they doing? Why do we have like these soldiers? Are they fight? What does it mean to be fighting over there so we don't have to fight over here? That doesn't make any sense. Your budgets and your priorities, that is what is critical. And so talking about change and talking about how we want to be a different world means nothing if we don't actually have the budget for it, if we're not actually putting our money where our mouth is. That's that question. The second question is about how do you as a young person deal with what's going on in the world? In terms of like working in aid or working at state. If you find that what you're doing is not protecting your personal health and well-being and your mental health, you should step away from it. No one is asking you to give your life and sacrifice yourself and your mental health for anybody. So many people in this space give up their marriages, they give up their spouses, they give up their children, they give up all of these things. And for what? And for what? You need to be focused on making sure that you protect your mental peace at all costs. Nothing is worth you destroying yourself mentally, physically, and emotionally. No job is worth that. Nobody is. These people that you work for, they are not your family. Your family is your family. They are not your friends. Your friends are your friends. This is a job. It is a good job, and it is a job that you can contribute and change a lot with the world. So many people I work with in diplomacy, I know so many people who gave up so much of their lives, didn't even go home to see their parents die. And for what? You know, and so you always have to ask yourself at the end of the day, is what I'm doing, is that so different and impactful and powerful that it's worth me giving up everything about who I am as a person? So never lose sight of who you are as a person. Don't let your mental health decline. Always look out for your own mental health and your own personal peace. And if you find that the job won't allow you to do that, walk away. Walk away. I'll be the first to tell you that I wish I had walked away from my job much sooner than I did, because I thought I'd be I thought I was making a difference and that I could change the State Department from within. And maybe you can, but I felt that as an immigration attorney, I was better off on the outside fighting to make a difference. And so that for me was a better place to be mentally and physically and emotionally. And so for you, my last thing is just like, yeah, no job is worth your mental health and your personal peace. If you got to walk away, it'll be okay.
Thank you so much for that really important reminder, Chris. And I think it really nicely echoes what also Beth shared. So I know we're over time, so I'll turn it back over to our host for the event today.
Great. Thanks, Swati, and thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts on this really important topic. We really do appreciate your support and also your just speaking with our community. I think this as someone mentioned in the chat, this is long overdue, and I think it's great that we're having this be one of many conversations that we'll be having moving forward. Just to wrap this all up, one of our staff members put a link to a survey in the chat box, and so please feel free to fill that out and help us, with future events. Again, that's the easiest way to really have a say in the conversation and see where this will go next. So we really would appreciate your feedback on our events as we move forward. So thank you again. We really appreciate your support, and we hope you stay safe and healthy during these uncertain times. We hope to see you at a future event during the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
So I want to point out that there was a call for you if you ever decide to run for our office. You have some fans in the audience.
Oh no, I would be dead in a day.